Alright, welcome everybody. My name is Michael Romagera. This is a presentation of organic molecules for the Fundamentals of Microbiology class at FRANU University, summer session of 2018. Alright, so a quick agenda for the day. We're going to do a quick overview of what organic molecules actually are. And then we're going to dive deeper into the four main groups, which are carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids, and then we're going to have a quick little wrap up on everything we covered today. Alright, so jumping right in. So a quick overview of what organic molecules are. Essentially, organic molecules are hydrocarbon molecules, and there are four major types of these organic molecules. Which we just talked about, which are carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. So one thing you need to remember is that organic molecules are mostly made up of chains of carbon atoms with hydrogens attached. Okay, so in this picture right here, you see that you have a basic structure of an organic molecule. So you have a carbon atom, which has 4 electrons in its outer orbit, and the 4 valence electrons are shared with other atoms. So essentially, the way we designate the sharing our electrons are with these lines. So moving on into the first organic compound I want to talk about today are carbohydrates. I think everyone's very familiar with carbohydrates. Okay, so you got to remember carbohydrates are sugars. Okay, sugars are carbohydrates. Remember that saccharide means sugar. And you can essentially divide up carbohydrates into 3 separate classes, okay? So you have your monosaccharides, you have your disaccharides, okay? And then you have your polysaccharides. So you got to remember that essentially saccharides mean sugar, okay? And then, of course, the prefix mono, di, and poly. Mono meaning 1, di meaning 2, and then poly meaning many, okay? So that mono, di, poly prefix you see here is going to show back up later in the presentation. Lipids. Lipids are fats, right? Everyone knows about fats. One of the most important characteristics of fats, okay, is they're insoluble in water, right? So think if you're in the kitchen and you're boiling some water and you want to make some pasta, but you want to put a little bit of vegetable oil in that water so the pasta doesn't stick. What happens when you put the oil in the water? The oil stays on top, right? It just kind of floats on the surface, okay? Another thing you want to remember about fats is fat, contains more calories of energy than any other molecule, right? So the simplest of fats are called fatty acids, which is what we're going to talk about first, okay? So you have your saturated fats, your mono, right, 1 unsaturated fat, and then your poly unsaturated fats, which means many, okay? Mono unsaturated fat looks a lot like a saturated fatty acid, but when you really get down to the nitty-gritty, you'll notice that between the 2 of the carbons, there's actually a double covalent bond, okay? So actually remember when we touched base earlier that every carbon atom can only have 4 covalent bonds. Well, since these 2 carbons are sharing the double carbon bond, they have fewer hydrogens actually attached to them. And then the third type of fatty acid we're going to dive into is the polyunsaturated fat, which is just simply an unsaturated fatty acid, except that the hydrogens are actually missing in more than one place. That is why it's called a polyunsaturated. Poly meaning more than one. Then the next type of lipid, which we're going to dive into, are the prostaglandins. Okay, these are highly associated with inflammation, right? So a prostaglandin is simply just 2 long chains of fatty acids joined with a loop of carbons at the end, okay? So The importance of the prostaglandin is this, okay? So whenever a cell is injured or suffers any type of trauma or the cell membrane is disrupted, when this phospholipid membrane gets damaged, a chemical process then converts some of these phospholipids into prostaglandins, okay? So these prostaglandins are essentially one of the main chemicals that cause inflammation. All right, I'm sure everyone is aware of inflammation. We've all experienced at some point in our lives. Okay, so remember, inflammation is characterized by those 4 telltale signs. You got redness, you got warmth, you got swelling, and you got pain. And then, of course, anytime you've been diagnosed or heard of a disease associated with inflammation, it always has the ending itis. So, okay, doctor said I have sinusitis, right? Inflammation of the sinuses. I have tendinitis, which means I got an inflammation of a tendon somewhere. I have, epicondylitis, which means the inside of there's inflammation on the inside of my elbows, which is known as golfer's elbow, right? So we've all very, very familiar with what inflammation is. Excuse me. And then here we are again. You have your monoglycerides, your diglycerides, and your triglycerides. Remember, mono meaning 1, di meaning 2, tri, of course, meaning 3. And then you have, of course, phospholipids. Now, the interesting thing about phospholipids is they're almost like some sort of schizophrenic molecule, right? Because there's one side of them that really likes the water, but then the rest of it really hates the water. So it's kind of mixed up on which way it wants to go. So that's a nice little way to kind of remember phospholipids. And then another type of lipid that, at first thought you may not think is actually a lipid or a fat are your steroid hormones, right? So you got to remember that all steroid hormones, if they're your androgens, if they're your female sex hormones, your mineralocorticoids, your glucocorticoid steroids, you got to remember that they all start with cholesterol, right? So cholesterol is made up of 4 rings of carbon joined together with the hydrogens attached. Okay. Of course, everybody has heard of steroids, but what are they really? So we got to remember cholesterol, which is the start point, right? It's synthesized in your liver, and then is synthesized in your liver as starting material, and then it's turned into steroids into the rest of the body. Okay, so moving on into proteins. Another very, very popular organic compound, proteins. Everyone's heard of proteins, but exactly what are proteins, right? So when you hear the word proteins, I want you to think of protein being like this little coiled up mess that looks like a slinky, of just all tangled up of just hundreds of amino acids. Okay, so when you join these amino acids together, they're typically called a polypeptide chain. Remember we talked about that earlier, meaning many. So essentially, when these things all coil up, these polypeptide chains, they coil up to create like this 3-dimensional chain, right? So those are your polypeptides, which are all, your amino acids make a polypeptide chain, which coils up into this kind of 3D shape that becomes a protein. It's actually very, very complex. And proteins have varied function, right? You can find them in eggs, you get your muscles in them, they're involved with antibodies, and they're also involved in your hormones, right? Like I said, they consist of amino acids, and they're also used to build and repair different tissues in your body, okay? I know, one very, very common thing is you hear protein and you think of muscle growth, right? But you got to remember that not only are proteins essential to the growth of muscles, they also play a very, very vital role in the building of bones, okay, cartilage, your skin and blood. So, there's a lot more to the story of proteins than just, all they do is build muscle. They play a very, very vital role in the functioning of your body day in and day out. So moving on to the last topic we're going to talk about today is nucleic acids. All right, so basically a nucleic acid is super similar to how we define a protein, right? So you got to remember that proteins were those coiled up slinkies and chains of amino acids. Well, nucleic acids essentially are coiled up chains of nucleotides, right? So what is a nucleotide? Okay, you got to remember a nucleotide, it consists of a base, a sugar, and a phosphate group, okay? Another important aspect of nucleic acids is ATP, okay? So adenosine triphosphate. ATP is essentially the gasoline that powers all living things, all right? It is a special high-energy nucleotide that provides energy for all the biological processes, all right? It's not necessarily in our food, but the cells of our body have to make it, all right? So ATP is extremely important. Another aspect of your nucleic acids is RNA, which is vital to protein synthesis. All right, so it is made up of a single chain of several hundred nucleotides all linked together. Another way to remember it is RNA nucleotides always use the sugar ribose, right? So R in the RNA, R in the ribose. Okay. And you got to remember that an actual molecule of RNA would just be several hundred nucleotides long. And then, of course, moving on to DNA. DNA is the largest molecule that we know of. You can't typically see molecules with an electron microscope. You can't see water or salt under an electron microscope. You can see proteins with an electron microscope. But there's only one molecule that you can see with a light microscope, and that molecule is in fact DNA. Okay, so to dive a little bit deeper into DNA, DNA is what forms the gene in a chromosome, right? So DNA is essentially our hereditary molecule that determines, what we look like. DNA also consists of two complementary chains and hundreds of millions of nucleotides long. So these two chains are kind of twisted together in that classic double helix ladder shape. So we're all very familiar with what DNA is and how it is depicted. So a quick review to kind of touch base on what we covered today. Remember, we dove in a quick overview on what the organic molecules are. We touched base on the hydrocarbon molecules. They're mostly made up of chains of carbon atoms with hydrogens attached. And we dove into what carbohydrates are. Remember, we learned that, carbohydrates are sugars, and sugars are carbohydrates. And there's hundreds of different types, but we really just focused in on monosaccharides, disaccharides, polysaccharides. Then we moved on over to lipids, which are fats. We learned that fats contain, more calories of energy than any other molecule. They're insoluble in water. We took a ride over to proteins. We learned that not only are proteins important to muscle growth, but they're also important to the formation of skin, cartilage, and play a very, very vital role in the body. And then we touched base on nucleic acids, which we learned about the RNA and the DNA and the different components of those. So I hope today gave you a better understanding of essentially what the four main organic molecules are. Hopefully today I was able to give you a better grasp on these four organic molecules, which essentially play a very important role in our lives from day to day. Whether we find carbohydrates, lipid, or proteins in our diets that we ingest daily, and kind of gave you an idea of how the nucleic acids work within our bodies as well. So thank you very much, and have a good rest of your day.